All right, let's get into a conflict that did way more than just define a decade. This is a war that helped shatter a superpower and, believe it or not, planted the seeds for conflicts we are still wrestling with today. We're talking about the Soviet-Afghan War. So, here's the big question we're tackling. How did a brutal, decade-long war in the mountains of Central Asia become the Soviet Union's Vietnam? And maybe even more importantly, what are the consequences that we're still living with? Let's dig in. To really understand the Soviet invasion, you got to rewind the clock a bit to 1978, because even before the first Soviet tank rolled across the border, Afghanistan was a nation in serious turmoil, a really critical piece on that great Cold War chessboard. The flashpoint? It was something called the Tsar Revolution. In April of '78, a pro-Soviet Communist Party, the PDPA, grabbed power in a really bloody coup. They promised to drag Afghanistan into the modern world, but their radical ideas clashed, and I mean really clashed, with the country's deep-rooted traditions. This wasn't just a small change. It was a political earthquake. Now, you look at this list, and on paper, some of these reforms might sound pretty progressive, right? But the problem wasn't just the policies themselves. It was the massive cultural collision. They were pushed through with extreme force, with zero regard for Afghan culture. This ticked off world landowners, enraged religious leaders, and led to these brutal purges of anyone who disagreed. The result wasn't modernization, it was a full-blown nationwide rebellion. So by late 1979, the communist government was about to collapse. And for Moscow, this was a red alert. The Soviet leadership just couldn't afford to lose a friendly communist state right on its southern border, especially to what they saw as religious extremists who probably being backed by their enemies. And so, on Christmas Eve, 1979, of all days, the invasion began. The official story was that the Soviets were invited to help stabilize things. But really, the goal was to prop up their failing puppet state and keep Afghanistan locked firmly inside the Soviet sphere of influence. And just like that, this wasn't simply a civil war anymore. It exploded into a massive proxy conflict of the Cold War. One of those wars where the big global powers fight each other indirectly through local allies. So on one side, you had the Soviet-backed Afghan government, and on the other, the Mujahideen, a whole coalition of rebel fighters, who pretty soon started getting a ton of support from the Soviet Union's biggest rivals. So who exactly were the Mujahideen? Well, their name basically means those who engage in jihad, but they weren't one unified army, not at all. They were a really diverse and often divided mix of different ethnic and tribal groups. They were united by just two things: their powerful Islamic faith and their absolute determination to kick out the foreign invaders. The Soviets had this huge, modern, conventional army with tanks and attack helicopters, but the Mujahideen had the ultimate weapon: the terrain itself. They used their incredible knowledge of the mountains and classic guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run ambushes, that kind of thing, to turn the rugged landscape into a graveyard for Soviet tanks and, just as importantly, Soviet morale. And they weren't fighting alone, not by a long shot. Through Pakistan's intelligence agency, the CIA launched Operation Cyclone. This was a secret program that funneled billions of dollars worth of weapons to the resistance. We're talking everything from sniper rifles to the now famous Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, which were a total game-changer against those Soviet helicopters. So what was supposed to be a short, clean operation quickly bogged down into a bloody, grinding stalemate. The Soviets could control the cities during the day, but the Mujahideen owned the countryside at night. The parallels to what America went through in Vietnam were just impossible to ignore. To try and break this deadlock, the Soviets just kept pouring more and more resources into the war. At its absolute peak, they had over 115,000 soldiers on the ground in Afghanistan. But it was never enough. For every village they managed to pacify, two more seemed to rise up in rebellion. It was a classic war of attrition, and it was one the Soviets just couldn't win. And the human cost, it's just staggering. While around 15,000 Soviet soldiers and 90,000 Mujahideen fighters were killed, the toll on the Afghan people was catastrophic. Estimates suggest that up to 2 million civilians died, and millions more were forced to flee their homes as refugees. Back home, the war was this big, unspoken secret. The state-controlled media barely ever mentioned it, but the truth had a way of getting home. In sealed zinc coffins, known by the military code Cargo 200. An undercurrent of quiet dissent began to grow.
The war was becoming this bleeding wound, not just on the battlefield, but deep within Soviet society itself.
Okay, so by the mid-1980s, something had to give. A new leader in the Kremlin, Mikhail Gorbachev, took a hard look at the situation and saw the war for what it was, a fatal wound. It was draining the already struggling Soviet economy and totally undermining his big reforms of glasnost and perestroika. He knew they had to get out. Now, getting out wasn't like flipping a switch. It was a slow, painful process. After years of talks, the Geneva Accords were finally signed in 1988, which set the timetable. And then, on February 15, 1989, the last Soviet commander, General Boris Gromov, famously walked across the Friendship Bridge back into Soviet territory. It was this hugely symbolic end to a disastrous 9-year occupation. But here's the tragic irony. The Soviet withdrawal didn't bring peace. It just removed one of the big players from the board. The communist government in Kabul actually clung to power for another 3 years, but without Soviet tanks to back it up, its collapse was just a matter of time. Afghanistan then plunged into an even more brutal civil war between the victorious and now rival Mujahideen factions.
The departure of that last Soviet soldier was the end of one chapter, for sure, but it was the beginning of a much, much darker one. The consequences of this war would ripple outwards, shaking the very foundations of a superpower and planting the seeds of future global conflicts. For the Soviet Union, the legacy was nothing short of catastrophic. The insane economic cost, the crushing blow to the Red Army's prestige, and the social unrest it stirred up back home, all of it just sped up the internal rot. It's no coincidence that just 2 years after the withdrawal, the Soviet Union itself completely ceased to exist. The long-term impact was absolutely devastating. Afghanistan was left in ruins, and out of the chaos of that civil war, the Taliban rose to power. And remember all those foreign fighters who had come to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets? Well, one of them, a wealthy Saudi named Osama bin Laden, used the lawless state as a perfect base to build his new network, Al-Qaeda. In so many ways, the road to September 11th began right here. Which leaves us with one last big question. Was this war the single thing that broke the Soviet Union's back, or was it just the final symptom of a system that was already dying? It's a question historians still debate, but what's certain is that this conflict is a critical piece of the puzzle for understanding the end of the Cold War. To see how other events fed into this bigger story, you should definitely check out the other explainers in our Cold War playlist. And if you want to keep making sense of complex history, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching.